Weird Halloween. I wanted to submit my story closer to Halloween. It's the only scary story that I actually have, but I really wanted to have the story read. And I don't think I can wait until Halloween, so please share it now. I don't live in a neighborhood that gets much trick-or-treaters anymore. I think trick-or-treating has changed a whole lot since I was a kid. Parents sometimes get together in pre-planned areas and do trick-or-treating in a huge parking lot and things like that. Or I know of a town where the parents all sit around in a gymnasium and the kids just go up to each one of the parents and get their candy that way. And personally, I hate that shit. It takes the entire spirit away from Halloween. I mean, Halloween is supposed to be this fun thing where you go around the neighborhood. Halloween is supposed to be this fun thing where you go around the neighborhood. You get to see the way people decorate their houses. I love it when parents really get into it and make the entire trick-or-treating experience just fun. So, I still give candy out at my house. But there are less and less children who come every year. But even after this bizarre thing that happened to me, I continue to give out candy. My neighborhood allows trick-or-treating to go until 10 p.m. However, there are kids, usually ones who are just a little bit older, middle schoolers, and maybe some high school kids, who will be out after 10. It doesn't bother me. If they come around even after midnight, I will give them candy. I was sitting by the window in my front room. I was thinking about Billy. I noticed this kid walking around in a costume. He wasn't a very large kid, and that made it strange for him to be out so late. It was close to midnight, and you never saw the young children out that late. He was dressed in a very odd costume. I don't even know how to describe it, other than the fact that it was white, and the cloth it was made out of was really ragged and ripped up. He was carrying what I assumed was a pillowcase, and I could tell he had a pretty good candy haul in it. I was happy I was getting a trick-or-treater, but I was quickly disappointed when he didn't come up to my house. He just kept walking down the street, not going to anyone's house, and pretty soon he was completely gone. I thought it was weird, but tried not to give it too much more thought. I went back to watching my movie. After a little while, though, I noticed he was coming back down the street. He wasn't on the sidewalk. He was walking down the middle of the street. He kept looking at the houses that lined the streets, but he didn't walk up to them. I suddenly realized that he probably thought it was too late to actually go up to my house and ring the bell. It was really late at night, and he must have been looking for a house to go to. I got up and got my bowl of candy. I thought I would just go out the front door and let him know that I had candy. That way, he could just come up and get the candy. I opened the door and went out onto my decorated porch. I noticed that the boy, dressed head to toe in white raggy cloth, was walking away from me. I shouted, "I have a ton of candy," to him. And the boy stopped and turned around. For a while, he just cocked his head and looked at me. He didn't walk toward me. He didn't respond. He just stood there. And I'm not sure how long that he did stand there. But it was a tiny bit creepy. But hey, it was Halloween. The boy then began walking slowly toward me. At that point, I felt just a little nervous. But again, I kept telling myself that this was Halloween. You can act creepy and weird on Halloween, because that is what you're expected to do. So he was just doing his job correctly. He was moving slowly, and I was guessing his costume was supposed to be a ghost or something. But as he got closer, I began to smell something very nasty. I couldn't tell what it was, but I could tell it was coming from him. The boy stepped up on my porch, holding his pillowcase in front of him. The pillowcase was red, a stark contrast to his costume. I grabbed a handful of candy, and he opened up the pillowcase. I was shocked at what I saw in the pillowcase. Dead rabbits. Bloodied and dead rabbits. I won't explain more of what it looked like, but it was terrifying and disgusting. I didn't move at first. How could I? I was too shocked. But the boy, he just stood there looking at me, with his pillowcase open. I did the only thing I could think of to do. I dropped the candy in the bag. When I did, he turned and left. I went back into my house and locked the door. The boy left, and he stopped walking up and down the street. He was gone. Honestly, I think it was a prank. Still, though, it was a sick prank. And there were not words that I can use to describe anybody who would do such a thing. I didn't report it. I mean, it was Halloween. People do stuff like that, or they at least play pranks. I just didn't really want to ever see something like that again. Clapboard Church. My family sang in the car together. We spent a lot of time in the car. I remember so fondly those early 1970s. My two older sisters and I, even though we didn't know it at the time, were lucky enough to have been born in the Deep South by two college-educated liberal parents, a handsome white dad, all the businessman, and a sort of a Bonnie Franklin of a mom. The big 33 LP records we had included Hair, Pearly, Fifth Dimension, Elton John, Bernie Taupin, Jim Croce, Carly Simon, Helen Reddy, you get it. We rode around in the car and sang because we got the music in us, joy. But because my father was a real estate developer, and sometimes we'd have to go look at land. Oh, the horrible boredom. And sometimes we'd have to go to a place somewhere between Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, called Camp Groundview. Edit to your heart's desire and research. My father had a partner in business, Dick Bevel. He and his wife Bobby had two girls, the younger Amanda and the older Jenny. Both girls were the same ages as myself and my sister Susan, respectively. This is 1974. That Camp Grandview was most likely a lovely place. I never liked the feel of it, though. Luckily, the Bevel sisters were courageous explorers of the woods nearby. One thing must be understood. The Alabama woods are much thicker, from foot to knee, than one might imagine. Full-on impenetrable, without conquistadors. Well, those woodsy gals, by meanwhile suburban microwave Atari folks, walked us right easy up to an abandoned old white clapboard church, and inside there stood an old piano. We were all as gals inside the old church, marveling at the place, probably pounding away on that old piano, when there came a Native American boy to the entrance of the church. He was our age, like 10. He had a societally acclimated short haircut. He wore a short-sleeved t-shirt and blue jeans, like from American Graffiti. He pulled a knife on us from a distance. He was a kid, too. He said, "Y'all better get out of here." You know what? We did. The reason I share this story is because that moment has not struck me as natural. I've since seen crime and stuff, like we all have, but that kid, that day, it never set electromagnetically right for me in any way. That knife-wielding, peer-pressuring, age-equal boy in the church, he was a ghost. I'm thankful we heeded his warning. This happened many years ago, in the mid-1960s, near my hometown in northern Minnesota, near Duluth, when I was about 11. My town had a lot of paper industries and railroad traffic. It was located on a river with lots of thick woods down there. My two friends and I took our 10-speed bikes on a ride down to the railroad tracks in the woods along the river. It was a hot midsummer day, and the woods were really thick. We walked our bikes along the rocks that were laid on the sides of the railroad tracks. I had to take a dump, so I left my bike with my two friends and went to the other side of the tracks, into the woods. Soon a train came along, and I was cut off from them. I was almost finished, and was using big weeds known to us as outdoor toilet paper, when I saw two old boots walking towards me. I looked up, and there was a creepy-looking old man with old green pants and a dirty unbuttoned flannel long-sleeved shirt. He grinned at me and had horrible yellow teeth. I started to get up and pull up my underwear and shorts, but before I could, he was right on me and grabbed my genitals with his dirty hand and started to do a nasty laugh. I was so scared I could hardly breathe and could not get my pants all the way up, but I ran like hell back to the railroad tracks. Fortunately, the train had gone by, and I was grabbing my shorts and could see my two friends on our bikes. I ran to them, and they just stared at me. Then I saw that creepy man behind me. He saw my friends and took off into the woods. We just ran our bikes along the rocks and then got back to the highway. We were so scared and did not say anything. I never told anybody about what had happened, and we never talked about it. Summer zoomed by, and we never went into the woods again. A few months later, I heard my dad talking to my grandpa about some old man that lived down a dirt road that had been arrested for molesting two brothers. They were talking about the article in the paper. I was in another room and did not say anything, but I found the paper and read the article. I'm not sure if it was the same man, but it was creepy. As far back as I can remember, I've had nightmares. Dreams of terror, horror, and dread. Dreams of fear, loss, and desperation. Thoughts and feelings of failure, cowardice, and defeat. I learned early on that I was thought to be an abomination, an evil child, a bad seed. Everything I did, everything I said, everyone I knew considered me to be another, something else. I barely passed in school. I lost money on my paper route. I sat on the bench in football, baseball, wrestling, and boxing. I was sloppy in my chores at home, and a bad son in my relationship with my parents. And the only time I felt adequate was when I was with my friends. Then, that was when I was a leader, a visionary, an inspiration, a protector. My friends and I would do this thing we called night walking. We would get up around 2 a.m., school night or not, sneak out of the house, meet up and walk the town, kicking over garbage cans, breaking bottles in the street, stealing the emergency flares out of our school buses, lighting them in the local cemetery, hooting, hollering, and basically raising any and all kinds of hell. It was fun, dastardly and liberating. This was, after all, 1966, and what with the mandatory duck and cover imposed once or twice per week, along with the daily Pledge of Allegiance and mandatory attendance at church every Sunday, with Bible study every Wednesday, the daily physical and verbal abuse at home and school, it left us all hurt, confused and desperate. So we thought that a little civil disobedient night terror wouldn't be so bad, like everything we experienced directly and indirectly back then, either good or bad. We all dealt with it pretty much the same way. If it caused pain, we cried. If it was funny, we laughed. If it was beyond our comprehension, we were mute. We didn't think much more on it than that, and because we mostly always got over it eventually, we told ourselves that it really didn't matter after all. This was life in small-town America. Who were we to think that it should be any different? After all, we thought ourselves immune, strong, tough, and resilient. We were soldiers. We were fighters. We were heroes. We told ourselves early on that the powers that be could punish our bodies with razor strops, belt buckles, groundings, going to bed without supper, or as we got older, beatings with fists and kicks, along with all the cussing and cursing, would make us tough, but could never really change our hearts or minds, at least as long as we didn't let them. We knew that deep down inside we were safe, protected, invincible, with the passing years. However, and the escalating abuse that resulted in apparent suicides, weird accidents and disappearances to Boys Town or juvenile detention centers, military schools, or prison, this would just prove to be naive at best, or just plain dangerous at worst. Just so the constant dreams had, and nightmares or worse, that went along with it day after day, year after year. Just so. I came home one early morning from a particularly wild night with Randy and Joey and Bob and my younger brother Rick, after we ended our escapade in an old farmhouse out in the outskirts of town. Looking east, we could see what looked like dawn encroaching on a rooftop horizon, but this proved to be impossible because since Joey had the only watch that was still working, I broke mine within 24 to 48 hours after getting a new one. It was only 3:30ish in the morning, and the sun, as far as any of us knew, was still sleeping. Unless, like a well-disciplined unit, everyone followed my lead, mounting our Stingray bicycles and peeling out for home. We would go by Bob's house first, and then Joey's, and then Randy's, and then mine and Rick's. As we approached Bob's, we could just see under the streetlight that all the windows had been broken out in every single room. The front and back doors were standing wide open, with what looked like bedclothes, sheets, pillows, spreads, etc., hanging or piled in disarray on the ground outside. And we quietly and gingerly tiptoed the piles, prodding with a stick for any signs of movement or blood or whatever, but there was nothing. They were all empty, out of place for sure, but otherwise nothing. They looked like they may have been blown off the clothesline in a high wind. The inside of Bob's parents' house, however, looked like a tornado hit it. Books, papers, dishes, pots and pans, drawers, everything emptied out and flung everywhere. The console television smashed, records broken, but no sign of anyone. Neither his parents nor his brother or sister. No signs of Duke, his dog. The cats. His pigeons he raised for contests. The chickens they raised for eggs, nothing. No one. Bob was in shock. We were all in shock. I asked him if he wanted to stick together, but he said no. So he left him there and proceeded up the street towards Joey's. It was the same. It was the same at Randy's, too. It looked like a mini hurricane or tornado hit it, but no bodies. Unlike Bob and Joey, Randy stayed looking for any sign of his parents and his brothers, none of which were anywhere to be found. By the time Rick and I got home, it was nearing 5 a.m., and yet there was still no dawn. Not even a hint in the east, but there was still this curious red tinge on the horizon. I didn't know what to make of it, so my brother and I made our way with at least as much caution as we had setting out of the house earlier that night. So my brother and I, we made our way out. Well, at least as much caution as we had setting out of the house earlier that night, but with a profound and overwhelming sense of dread. Everywhere, it was the same. Windows broken, doors flung open, hanging sometimes on a single hinge. Clothing, sheets, towels, paper litter, crockery, etc., strung out for hundreds of feet around our house, the neighbors' houses, and still no one, nothing. Rick by this time was starting to cry. I was 12, so I wasn't supposed to cry, even though I felt like it. But he was only 10, and like me, was tired and hungry and scared. I tried to get him to wait for me outside while I went inside to what used to be the kitchen. I wanted to find some milk or lemonade or leftovers from supper, but he wouldn't have any of it and clung to me like a terrified baby monkey. It didn't matter though, because there was nothing edible. Everything was smashed and decorated the floor, ceiling, and walls like it was left after a food fight at school. Even when I tried the tap, there was no water. Not even a drop. I went outside with Rick in tow to Moscow's doghouse to see if there was any water left in its bowl. But there was none. We walked further into the backyard, to the garden, only to find that all of my mother's tomatoes, vegetables of raspberries, strawberries, apples, peaches, apricots, etc., were desiccated to the consistency of hard wood, some still hanging on the branches. I told Rick you'd have to be a termite to appreciate it, but he didn't laugh. He just stood there mute, the tear tracks streaking the dirt on his face. We were thirsty, but there was absolutely no moisture to be had anywhere, and it was then that my brother really started bawling hard, coughing and choking, hyperventilating, like he would do, but there were no wet tears. The next thing I knew, he started running across the backyard, vaulting the barbed wire fence, tearing both of his knees and thighs with streaks of rapidly drying blood, falling down on the other side, with me right behind him, stumbling down the ditch and up onto the rail bed, just in time for an early morning eastbound silver streak ripped us apart forever. After it had passed, I saw that there was no one left on the other side. Country road. Driving was a pretty big deal to me growing up. I couldn't wait to learn how. When I was 13, my uncle decided to teach me how to drive. This really wasn't too unusual. My dad actually learned to drive when he was younger than me. Living out in the country, I don't know. Maybe there wasn't a whole lot else to do but drive and teach people how to drive. But honestly, I think the reason so many of us were looking forward to learning how to drive, and then learned how to drive at such a young age, was because of the geography of the area that we grew up in. Driving was necessary. Everyone lived so far apart that if you didn't drive, or at least knew someone who did drive, you couldn't spend so much time with other people. And we were a long, long way from having internet, and even cable wasn't too common in that area. I remember my second cousins actually had one of those old satellite dishes. One of the really big ones that moved slowly whenever you changed the channel. So I was 13 when I learned. And once I learned how to drive, I was allowed to drive around for the most part. I didn't get my license until I was older. But that wasn't a big deal either. Even the police in town wouldn't pull you over if they knew you didn't have a license. That is just how common it was for anyone to drive at a young age, or even at an older age, but without a license. So when I was 15, I had a really scary experience. My dad had to catch a bus to go to a funeral of a friend who lived out of state. He didn't want to leave the pickup truck at the stop, so he had me drive him to the bus stop. I was then to take the truck home. So I was driving home, and was going through the town, heading toward the road that would take me home. I stopped at a four-way stop. There was already a car sitting perpendicular to me. A young man was sitting in the driver's seat. There was an older guy in the passenger seat as well, and a third guy sitting right behind him in the back of the car. The guy driving looked really nervous for some reason. I mean, I couldn't really tell you what I saw in his eyes, but he was obviously very, very uncomfortable. He had the right-of-way, but he hadn't gone yet. He was just sitting there. He looked at me, then at the road, then at me again, and then the road again. Finally, the guy sitting behind him nudged the driver's seat pretty roughly. Immediately after he did, the guy pulled into the intersection. He went straight. He glanced at me a few times as he drove on. I still don't know completely why I did it, but I decided to wait a moment after the car had driven forward. I was also going forward, which was a different direction than the car was going. However, in the middle of the intersection, I changed my mind. I turned and began going the direction that the car was going. It was the look in the guy's eyes that bothered me the most. It was a very desperate look. That's the only way I could describe it. Plus, I guess, with how quickly he reacted when the guy behind him had nudged the back of the chair. They hadn't gotten far ahead of me, but I also tried not to get too close to them. If something negative was going on, I didn't want to endanger the driver or anything. Because if something bad was going on, he was obviously going to be the victim of it. The car drove out of town, and I followed it. After following it for a bit, the car made a turn onto a dirt road. I was still not too far behind it, so I drove out in that direction as well. And I followed it as I went on. The car drove down off of a hill and further out into the country. It turned off more than once onto other country roads, and I kept following it. So it is probably obvious to you listening to this what I was doing wrong. I was only 15 years old, and this was a long time ago, so I didn't realize it myself. But I was completely making it obvious to everyone in the car that I was following them. But I wasn't thinking, and I hadn't watched a lot of movies where it was obvious that someone was being tailed. So I didn't think that anyone really would have caught on. We drove really far out. But I never thought about ceasing following the car because I was worried about the driver. Now, we were traveling in one direction. That road continued straight, but there was a turn onto another dirt road that went up into a hill. The turn was nearly a complete 180-degree turn. The car turned and began going up the hill. And then I turned and began following it. We didn't get very far up the hill before the car stopped. And of course, I had to stop with it. The road going up the hill was even narrower than the one we had taken in the first place. There was no way I could drive around the car without falling off the side of the hill. The driver's side back door opened and someone got out. I noticed that whoever it was had something in his hand, and he was walking right toward my truck. With my lights on, it was hard to see what the guy was carrying, but I figured it was a weapon. Not knowing what to do at first, I took my foot off the brake, and the pickup lurched forward a bit. The man recoiled, and I put my foot back on the brake. Remember, the road was narrow, so I couldn't jump out of the way. I revved the engine a little, realizing that I had intimidated him a little bit. After a moment, the guy in the passenger front seat got out of the car too, and he had something in his hand. I could tell it was a tire iron. He began walking toward me. I was happy to see that it was a tire iron. Remember, I was a country boy who was driving a pickup truck without a license. That wasn't the only illegal thing I was doing. I put on the brake, and I reached behind the seat of the truck. My dad always kept his loaded shotgun behind the seat. I grabbed it and a few shells. Putting the shells in my pocket, I opened the door to the truck. Both guys stopped. I'm not sure if they were able to tell what I had in my hand, but when I pointed it at them, they got the general idea, and they froze. And that is when the unexpected happened. The car took off down the road. At first, one of the guys turned and went to go after them, but I yelled at them to stop. They did, and I made them throw down their tire irons. When the car was gone, I slowly got back into my truck. I backed down the road, intending to get back down. When I did, I saw the car coming back down toward me. He must have gone up and found a spot to turn around in. I made room for him, and I let him pass me back on the dirt road we drove in on. I then followed the guy out of the road, leaving the two guys stranded on the side of the hill. I followed the guy back into town. He stopped at the sheriff's station and got out of the car. We both went in and talked to the sheriff about what had happened. The victim hadn't known the guys. They were hiding in his car while he was working at the grocery store. He got into his car after work without checking it. They were forcing him to drive out to that hill, not knowing why he was being taken there. When he had seen me, he had been hoping that his look of distress was conveyed to me, and thankfully it had been. Fully. I couldn't describe the guys, but the sheriff didn't need my description. They got caught and went to jail. A walk. The area and the era that I grew up in is a whole lot different than things in my life are today. I grew up in Monroe County, Ohio. The closest town to where I lived was a place called Louisville. I, in fact, just looked it up before I began writing this down. I haven't been back there in a very long time, and I was just curious about it. At the last census, the village of Louisville had a population of 176 people. It's weird, because it seemed so much bigger when I was growing up there. I was an only child. Furthermore, we lived out in an unpopulated part of the county. Actually, I guess with Monroe County, that could be any part of it. Well, I really liked hearing and telling scary stories growing up. But of course, enjoying that sort of thing always made me scared when I was home by myself. And although it didn't happen a lot, it did happen more often during the summertime. My dad drank a lot, and he would get together with his cousins or siblings, and they would drink way into the night. But anyway, our house was like an hour away from the town, and we didn't have air conditioning or anything like that. And it would often get much hotter in the house than it would be outside. When I was 13, I remained home when my parents went to visit relatives. I enjoyed the time by myself, and they didn't mind. This night was really, really hot, and the house was unbearable. So I decided I was going to go out for a walk to see if the air outside was any cooler. It was, so I ended up going for quite a walk. I knew I wouldn't be getting much sleep, and I knew that my parents would not be back anytime soon, so I just had no plan on how long I would be out. The houses were few and far between on this road. They were so far apart, and most were only old trailers that older people lived in or were abandoned, so I didn't expect to run into anyone or to see anyone. The night was clear. I remember that, and I was a bit far away from home. I was walking by a field of crops and just was deep in thought, and that was when I heard it. I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from out in the field. I had heard screams in horror movies, but this was different. This was a scream, real terror and real fear. And I stopped, terrified myself. Almost immediately, it was followed by another scream, and then another, and another. Each one was just completely awful, and all I could do was stand there, looking out over the huge field, wondering where the scream had come from. There may have been 6 or 7 screams altogether, and then it was quiet, and I just stood there, wondering what had just happened. I didn't know what to do either. I just kept looking out over the field, trying to tell where the scream had come from. And that's when I saw, from a distance, a figure stand up in the middle of the field. It was as if he had been kneeling, or something, and had just risen up. I had no idea if he had seen me or not, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back toward my house. My running was making a lot of noise on the gravel, but that was the least of my concerns. If someone had been getting murdered or something, I didn't want to be the next victim. By the time I got back to my house, I was exhausted. But I didn't slow down. I ran into the house and locked the door. And then I was terrified of being in the house. I hadn't locked it when I left. We just didn't live in a place where you had to do that. So then, I had to check out the entire house in order to feel like I was safe. I spent the rest of the night in the corner of my room. I waited for my parents to get home before going to bed. I explained to them what happened. That was a mistake because my dad was very drunk. He grabbed his rifle and got back into the car and drove off. He drunkenly decided he was going to find whoever it was that was causing that person to scream. My dad was gone for like 2 hours, and it was terrifying the entire time. We didn't know what to think. We wondered if he had gotten killed or something, especially because at one point we heard gunshots in the distance. This was not abnormal for our area though. That night, it just terrified us more. And my dad finally got back. Rather than tell us what had happened, he passed out in his chair. He didn't remember anything about the search in the morning. None of us ever found out what had happened that night. hike. This isn't a very long story, and I will do my best to get to the point as quickly as possible. It happened a long time ago, though, back in the 70s. I like the wilderness quite a bit. I like to go camping and hiking every time that I get a chance to do so. My friend Jim, who I'd known all of my life, loves it too. We go camping and hiking several times a year. Each time we always try to find a new place to explore. And when we were 25 years old, we had the freakiest experience of our life. I have to admit that we don't always hike in places that we were allowed to, and this was one of those times. So because of that, I guess I shouldn't mention where it happened. Anyhow, this was going to be a pretty long hiking trip. We got in contact with some other people who had hiked the area before. That way, we were able to get some idea of where we were going. Also, we never really got lost. It was absolutely a lot easier to get lost back then than it is nowadays. Jim has a talent that is pretty useful for going on hiking trips in non-hiking areas. He is pretty good at mapping out where we go, which makes it easy enough for us to find our way back pretty easily. So on this particular trip, we were going to be out hiking for about 2 weeks. I'll tell you one thing about where we were hiking. It was so large that even with 2 weeks of hiking, there is no way we would be able to explore the entire area. But that's cool. That just made the whole thing seem much more fun in my view. We'd been out for about 5 days, and something really disturbing happened. We had set up our camp for the night. Jim was looking around for firewood. As I was trying to get some other things situated, Jim came up to me. He looked really freaked out. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me he had to show me something. I then followed Jim, and he led me toward a creek. My first thought was why he didn't suggest that we move our camp down to the creek. But that didn't matter when he led me over to a tree, and I was shocked at what was there. A severed human hand was nailed to the tree, and I'm not an expert on how quickly a severed limb would decay, but it didn't look like it had been done a very long time ago. It was missing a thumb, and 2 nails had been driven through its palm, attaching it to the tree. Obviously, we both had reason to panic, and we did. It was getting closer to sundown, and we were in the middle of nowhere at that point, and there might be some homicidal person out there. Anyone crazy enough to chop off someone's hand and then nail it to a tree was certainly crazy enough to hurt 2 young hikers in the middle of the night. We didn't really have much that we could do, though, other than continue our trip. We were not quite halfway through it, but pretty close. Getting out of the woods was not going to be something that we would be able to do very fast. I have heard some stories that are similar to ours, where people are hiking and they find or see something scary, and then they hurry to do their best to get out of the woods. But hurrying through the wilderness is never a good idea to begin with. It's a good way to get lost or injured. We went ahead and went back to our camp. All we could really do was try and be aware of what was going on around us. The first night, after finding the hand, had to be the scariest. The whole thing was so fresh in our brains. But we didn't hear anything, and we hadn't seen any other indication that anyone else was around. The following day, we started back the way that we had come from. Having traveled the path toward the area that we had found the hand in, it was comforting to see the familiar area on the way back. We slept a little bit sounder that night, but we were still on edge the entire time. When day came, it was always a bit of a relief. Even though the wilderness can be scary at both the day and the night, it was obviously less during the day. After a couple days, we really weren't worried at all anymore. It seemed much less likely that we would run into anybody if we hadn't by then. We eventually made it out of the woods. We called rangers in the area. We had to admit that we were trespassing, but we had to let them know what we had found. Jim provided his map to them. One of the rangers asked us why we hadn't taken the hand down off the tree. I didn't feel like I really needed to answer that. Who wants to pull a nailed hand off a tree? But that's the story. Maybe not terrifying, but I'm sure no one wants it to happen to them. Shock. Back in the 1980s, my parents got divorced. My dad got custody of us, and we moved down south, but on the East Coast. We were there for a couple of years, and that is when my dad met a younger woman, and they eventually got married. Not long after they got married, my dad decided to leave his job. He was in the military, but he never really had much love for the military. Since his new wife was originally from the same area that my dad was from, he decided to move back to that area. There has to be a little bit of backstory to understand exactly what happened. It was my mom who left my dad, and my dad was a real petty jerk. He pined over my mom, even as he was married to a different woman. So even though she paid child support, which my dumbass stepmother normally spent on herself, he wouldn't let us talk to our mom. And if we expressed any interest in talking or having anything to do with her, he would browbeat us until we realized he wouldn't stop, until we pretended we didn't want anything to do with her. My stepmother's parents lived in Wheeling, West Virginia. The place we lived in was in Ohio, but it was only maybe an hour and a half away from their place. None of our side of the family lived very close, so the only people we ever visited was them. Other than the time we were in Wheeling, we were always out in the country. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it explains why I was in the situation that I was in the day that this story happens. I liked talking to my mom, but I never got a chance to do it. If I tried calling her at home, I would get in trouble. Even if I did it when my dad was not at home, he would know by the phone bill. So the only way I could think of to contact her was to do it when we visited my stepmother's relatives in Wheeling. I would decide I wanted to go out for a walk. No one minded me doing that, because no one really cared about me. I would walk through the town and get myself to a payphone. I had to find one that was far away from the house, just so no one would catch me making the call. Then I would make a collect call to my mom. She would call me back, and we would talk on the phone. I didn't realize at the time how dangerous it was for a 12-year-old to be walking around Wheeling at that time. I haven't been back since then, in the 80s. So I don't know if the place is still a hellhole or not, but it was back then. I didn't care, though. I only ever got a chance to talk to my mom when we went over to visit those people in Wheeling. On this day, I went to the phone as usual to make my phone call. I talked to my mom for about an hour or so. And then, finally, by the end of the phone call, I noticed something that really frightened me. My stepmother was driving down the street. This was odd, and as a 12-year-old who had a possessive and sometimes abusive father, I was a bit scared of what might happen if he knew I'd been talking to my mom. So, in order not to be seen, I ducked into an alley. I wasn't sure whether or not my stepmother was looking for me, or she was just out driving. So I decided I would walk to the back of the alley, and take a different walk back to their house. As I was walking through the alley, and about to turn a corner, I heard it. A gunshot. I'd never heard a gunshot that wasn't out in the country when someone I knew was hunting. This was in an alley, in a city, and was near me. Looking back, I saw where the gunshot came from. It came from the back porch of a house. There, I saw a guy lying on the porch, with a guy standing over him, holding a gun. I was in shock. I'd never seen a person get shot before. And yeah, technically, I hadn't seen the person get shot. But I saw the person immediately afterward. What brought me out of the shock, though, was when I noticed that the guy with the gun turned, and he looked over at me. He seemed as surprised to see me as I had been to see what had happened. He looked like he was about to move off the porch. I was scared that he thought I saw whatever happened, and I turned and ran away. I went right back to the main street and ran off at full speed. I didn't stop until I got to the relative's house. And once I was there, I had to call 911. I ended up going to court, and fortunately, the person who was shot did not die, but the shooter did end up going to prison. Friend. When I was a teenager, I did have a hard time finding new friends. The reason was that my family was constantly moving. I lived with my dad and my stepmother for a few years, and things were like that with them. There were even several times when we had moved more than once in a single year. When I left them and went to live with my mom, I thought things would become a little more steady. But we ran into some problems about a year after I moved in. We had to find a new place to live, and I had only been at this new school for about a year. I tried everything I could to continue going to that school after we moved. My mom worked very close to the school, and I would go into work with her and then go to school. However, this only lasted for the fall and winter. I was having to get up at 4 a.m. to go into work with her, and then sit around for 2 hours until school began. So, when I began going to the new school in January, I was once again without any real friends, and it was pretty tough. There were a few guys who would talk to me. 2 guys would always be standing outside of my French class, and would talk to me like they knew me when I went to the class. They even knew my name, but I later found out that this was just a huge coincidence. Interestingly enough, I looked like a friend of theirs who had the same name. So by the time summer vacation came around, I really hadn't made any friends. I didn't consider those guys friends because I didn't even know what their names were. Other than talking to them outside of class, I had no real interaction with them at all. So the beginning of summer was a bit rough on me. I spent a lot of time by myself, and I went walking at night a whole lot as well. I really didn't think I expected to meet anyone, especially not by taking late night walks. But for some reason, taking the walks made me feel like I was a lot less alone. But each walk ended exactly like the one before it. I would end up going home all by myself, sitting in my bedroom for a while, before finally going to sleep. Maybe about a month into the summer break, I had a really unsettling occurrence. I was out walking pretty late at night. It was pretty hot outside, but that didn't really ever bother me. I was walking along the street and past some businesses, and there was a car that was parked on the side of the street with someone sitting inside it. He looked at me as I passed, but I didn't think much about it. I walked by and down the street. When I was walking, I heard a car start, and immediately looked back to see if it was the car that I had seen. Indeed, it was that car. I didn't think anything about it. Perhaps the person was just waiting for someone, or talking on his phone or something. There was no reason at all for me to feel concerned about any of it at first. I turned down a residential street. As I was walking, I happened to turn back, and glanced back toward the turn in the road that I took. And when I did, I noticed that the car had turned also. Still, this was not weird. However, what was strange about it was that it was driving very slowly. and this made me think for some reason that I was being followed. Of course, when you think you're being followed, the thing to do is to take a turn down a different street and see if the car turns and continues to follow you. So when I got to the next street, I turned and went down it. Sure enough, the car turned and continued to follow me down the road. I was a bit worried, of course, but I tried not to get too panicked. It still could have been a coincidence. I would make another right turn and see what happened. I made the very next turn, which would have taken me back to the original residential street that I had been on. And sure enough, the car turned again and kept following me slowly. So at that point, I knew that I was being followed. However, I didn't know why. I figured the best thing for me to do was get back on the residential road and then make my way back to the in-town road I had originally seen the car on. So I tried hurrying up and going as quick as I could go. That was when I heard the car speed up, and right when it got closer to me, I heard a sound that sounded like a gunshot. It scared me so much that I ran up and onto the porch of the closest house to me. Then, the car sped up and was soon way out of sight. I wasn't sure what to do. I was convinced that I had just narrowly escaped a drive-by shooting. But what did I do next? I just decided I would try to walk home and keep my bearings about myself. Rather than walk back into town, I continued taking residential streets trying to get home. I heard a car approaching a few times, but fortunately each time it was not the car that I think tried to shoot me. I eventually made it home. I stopped taking walks like that at night for a little while though. This is all I can figure about what happened. I obviously looked like someone the guys in school knew. I was out walking almost every night. It was possible that the people in the car had seen me and mistaken me for that guy. Perhaps he was targeted by them or something, I don't know. But it absolutely seemed like the only reason I could come up with for what had happened. Not knowing anyone in town. Why would someone try to shoot me? The yard. I have lived many places in my life. One I remember very well would be the house I lived in when I was 13 years old. It was out in the country on top of a hill. We had a huge yard, probably about a whole acre. But it wasn't just a flat acre. Being on top of a hill, it of course had curves and things like that. It made mowing the lawn a very difficult task to do. Other than trying to mow up and down the hill, there was something else that I really hated about mowing there. We would always get tons of snakes in our yard, and every once in a while, when I was mowing, I would accidentally run over a snake, and it was a terrible thing every time that it happened. Not only did I feel bad for the poor snake that was getting chopped up into pieces, but it was also quite a disgusting experience for me as well. I do personally find snakes to be really scary creatures, so I would occasionally see one in the yard even when I was not mowing. For the most part, my reaction to seeing a snake is the same each time. I run away as quickly as I can. So this one time, I was getting ready to mow the lawn. I went walking around the yard first, trying to see if there were any snakes in the yard. I did this often because I didn't want to run them over. If there was a snake in the yard, I would try to mow around it, or I would mow later when it was gone. As I was walking around, I heard a really weird noise. I couldn't explain it well because I'd never heard it before. Looking in the direction of the weird noise, I realized what the noise was. There was a rattlesnake in the yard, and it wasn't far from me. I wasn't sure what to do. I had never encountered a rattlesnake before. Most of the snakes I came across are non-venomous, and I didn't even know that rattlesnakes lived in our area. Because of that, I never learned exactly what to do when you came across one. and I was only about a few feet away from it. I stood there, looking at the snake for several moments. It was pointed in my direction. I cannot call it looking in my direction because I knew that snakes were blind, but if it could see, it was looking right at me. I didn't move. I was suddenly aware of my heartbeat and my breathing, and at any moment I thought, if I made the slightest move, the snake would strike at me. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at the snake and not moving. It was the only thing I knew of to do, so I was just standing there. I guess I was hoping that the snake would eventually leave if I stood still long enough, but that didn't seem to be happening. I decided I would try to back away from it. I was terrified that the slightest move would set the snake off and it would get me, so I moved my foot back as slowly as I possibly could. When my foot was completely lifted off the ground, I was scared to put it back down. I did, and braced myself for the attack from the snake. To my relief, it didn't attack me, so I repeated the motion with the other foot. I was going as slowly as I possibly could, and then, when I was able to take another step back, without the snake attacking, I kept repeating the motion, and when I thought I was far enough away that the snake couldn't strike, I turned and I ran as fast as I could back to the house. I made the mistake when I got in the house of telling my older brother about the snake. He went out for it, intending to kill it. Unfortunately, though, the snake must have left the yard after I left. As I mentioned before, I don't like snakes having to die. I have since found out that what I did was the correct thing to do when there was a rattlesnake around. I was fortunate that I did this, rather than just turning and running like I normally did when I saw a snake. I hate to think about what could have happened if I did that. Personal experience. So, okay, I've shared some personal stories before, and I think most people understand my viewpoint on the paranormal. I don't take a hard-line stance that the paranormal as a whole either exists or does not exist, and I think most people understand my viewpoint. I do, however, judge everything I can on an individual case-by-case basis. With me having epilepsy, hearing and seeing something can be chalked up to partial seizures. Normally, I can have an auditory hallucination, but visual is not out of the question. I had a very odd experience a few nights ago. All I'm going to do is explain what happened, and I'm going to let everyone listening come up with their own conclusions. I was up late last night doing some work on this very video, but also keep in mind that I tend to sleep a non-conventional schedule to begin with. You also know that we have many cats, 7 of them at the moment. Only a couple of the cats ever come into my room, and normally none of them sleep in here. That's just because it's difficult for me to sleep when I think I might have to wake up for some reason. Napping is not an easy thing for me because of this, but if I go to bed and I am thinking that a cat is in my room, and that it might need to wake me up at some point in order to be out of that room, I will always sleep with my door closed. Well, anyway, my sister, mom, and I ran some errands. One of them I will tell you about later, but one of them was a trip to the laundromat. I always enjoy laundry day, because nothing feels better than laundry, fresh pajamas, and bed linens. But I was doing work, so I wasn't able to get to sleep until really late that night. I sleep on my side, and it normally takes me a while to fall asleep. So I curled up on my bed and I laid down on my pillow, ready to sleep. Maybe less than a minute after laying down, I experienced something very strange. I felt a cat jump on my bed. I have a desk next to my bed that is higher than the bed itself, so it felt as if the cat jumped down from the desk, landed on my bed and part of my leg. This caused the bed to shake and for me to jump upright in bed. Of course, my very first thought was that one of the house cats got into my room, so I called out for the ones that answered to their names. There was no response. Then I had to get up and look around. and I searched the entire bedroom. There were no animals in my room at all. I searched in every possible place that one might have tried and hid, but I was unable to find anything. There was no animal of any kind in my room. So I went back to bed, but I was unnerved. I couldn't explain what had happened. If it was a hallucination, it was not like my normal hallucinations. There was some noise, but mainly I felt a cat jump on me, and it shook my bed a little when it happened. And yes, I darted straight up when I felt it, and I had assumed the cat had run off. But if this happened, there was no way the cat could have got out of my room. As I was laying down, I remembered something. As everyone knows, we had to put down our cat Althea earlier this month. She was cremated, but that process seemed to take a long time for some reason. We weren't able to pick up the ashes until that day that we were at the laundromat when we were running our errands. So that night was the very first time those ashes had been in our house since we had to take Althea to the vet. So, whenever I shared my experiences like this, I don't tell you what to think of them. Personally, I don't think it was supernatural. After I had my brother's ashes in my room, I often felt someone pressing their foot down on the foot of my bed. Anybody who follows my channel a lot might remember I mentioned this before. This was something that my brother usually did. I think my mind very likely created the sensation to comfort itself after the losses. But I also won't tell anyone what to think. It did scare me quite a bit when it happened. My father has held the position of the manager in various tea gardens across Darjeeling in India. With this responsibility, our family has had the chance to stay in some amazing British-made bungalows scattered around the hill station. A little background to the ones who are not familiar with this concept. India was under the British rule for many years, and since most of the country's temperatures rose to 45 degrees Celsius in the summers, the English decided to settle within the tea plantations. One of those areas is Darjeeling, with a climate similar to that of the UK. They built beautiful bungalows, and they still house the managers who are responsible for the well-being of the tea gardens, like my father. So now to my story. One of the bungalows where we lived was in a place called Cedars, on the outskirts of Darjeeling, which was separated from the small village situated nearby. We lived there for almost 16 years, and boy do I have stories. Generally, every household helper that was provided to us by the company that my father worked for warned my mother about the various happenings that would occur within the place. My mother usually brushed them off, but as it would get boring, would indulge in some stories from time to time. That was until she had a tale of her own. My mother has always been a light sleeper. One night when we were all asleep, I nestled between my parents as I was only 3. She jolted awake for no reason. She lied down with her eyes closed in the dark and waited for sleep to come. However, she started to hear light footsteps in the room. The floors were wooden, so the sounds were pretty obvious, and she also realized that they were light, as it sounded similar to my footsteps as I was small. Her first thought was that I was not in bed and was running around. However, when she tried to feel for me, there I was, sound asleep. Now she was alert. Gradually, the footsteps were joined by another set. Now, there were 2 distinct sounds of footsteps running to and fro. My mother started sweating, and was so fear-stricken that she couldn't even wake us up. The second one was as light as the first, and just when she thought that it couldn't get worse, the door to the room slammed open. Sweating bullets, she tried to hear any sound, but now the room was completely silent. She didn't move and eventually fell asleep. This was just the beginning. The servants continued to complain about furniture being moved when we were away, and voices, mostly similar to my mother's, calling out to them from the rooms when she would be outside in the lawn. As I grew up, I would occasionally hear footsteps when there was no one around in that room. I got my room and didn't experience anything until I was in my teen years. I shifted schools and had to stay with my aunt in the main town of Darjeeling. I would come back for the weekends and would sleep in my room. One night, as I was texting my then boyfriend on my sad flip phone, I heard knocking on my window. I lifted the curtains to see nothing but pitch darkness. I brushed it aside. I brushed it off as some insect crashing on the glass and went to sleep. However, every weekend would be the same, and I would always ignore it. This didn't sit well with the thing, as the water in my bathroom would turn on its own. Most nights, I would wake up to the sound of running water. I did nothing about it because I was a teenager. As time passed by, my mother started to notice a pattern in the incidents she had with the deaths taking place in the village. Every time someone would die in the village, there were whispers, indiscernible words being repeated over and over by unknown voices in different rooms, and weird orbs of light floating in the dark. This all came to a head when my younger brother saw something in the living room one night. He was only 2, just learning to talk, and could not finish his sentences properly. Usually, he would sit by my father in the study, trying to draw and help my father with his work. One weekend as I was home, I sat with my mother watching television in her room, while my brother and father were in the study. The living room was dark and shared a door with the study. My brother was facing the door, and according to my father, he started screaming and crying hysterically, pointing towards the dark room and babbling incoherent words. As he was inconsolable, my father called for my mother and me. After calming down a bit, all he could say was, "Eyes, scary eyes." Well, needless to say, I slept with the lights on that night. One chilling incident occurred when we had to attend a wedding in a different state. There were night guards who always stayed in 2. However, one night, one of the guards was unwell, so the only guard made his rounds. He saw or heard nothing unusual. He settled down after a while and began to nod off in his cabin. Suddenly, he felt a cold arm on his back, and he jolted awake. He was spooked, but thought he was just imagining things in his sleepy state. After making another round, he settled back in his cabin. This time he was wide awake and reading the newspaper when he felt the cold arm on his side. And that was it. He ran without looking back and returned only the next morning with several of the villagers in tow. The last major incident was when it was just my father and me, as my mother and brother were out of town. I had recently adopted my adorable dog, Muffin, and he was just 2 months old. He usually slept by the foot of my bed, and this night was no different. I was on my phone, and Muffin was fast asleep, when he shot straight up and started growling at the bathroom door, which I had left open. I tried to calm him down, but he started barking. I nearly shat myself, but eventually managed to calm him down. This night, too, I fell asleep with the lights on in my room. I had a dreamless sleep. However, in my sleep, I heard a melodious voice of a lady say, "Wake up, honey," in a caring tone. You should understand that while India has the second highest English-speaking population, it was unlikely for the surrounding village to have someone speak the language so clearly. I was suddenly awake, and as I opened my eyes, I saw nothing. It was pitch dark. The lights had cut out, and I couldn't see a thing. I started panicking, as I am scared of complete darkness. I felt for Muffin, but couldn't find him. I started fumbling for my flashlight, and when I found it, I ran to my father's room. This was the last incident in that house, before we had to move. I don't know what was in that place, but I know that soft voice wanted nothing but the best for me. Shiloh and the Shadow of Sound. Killer Orange Cat, I know you're skeptical of paranormal stories, but this one is true. My family is from the South. We lived in Memphis, Tennessee until I was 11, and then moved to Missouri. Shortly thereafter, and because my dad was such an asshole, my parents got divorced. After that, we moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. Since my mother was now a single parent, and because she had family in Little Rock, we moved there with me and my 5 other sisters. Our only brother stayed in Memphis, Tennessee. To make a long story short, my uncle, who was my mother's brother, had 60 acres of land, and he invited my mother, me, and my sisters to put a trailer on his land. He set up the electricity, water, sewage, etc., all by himself. After we moved there, one of my sisters was given a Siamese cat. One day, she had kittens under the trailer. I followed her and noticed the hole in the fiberglass lining she had them in. Because of the fiberglass, I knew that I had to get the kittens and bring them inside as soon as possible. The first one I took was this tiny little life, a runt. She was a multicolored chocolate tortoise shell. It was then and there that I decided she would be mine. I named her Shiloh. Despite being the runt, Shiloh had the heart of a lion. She was a fierce little thing. Once she fought off a stray Doberman pinscher that was trying to get to her first litter. Between Shiloh's claws and my yelling, the dog bolted, and Shiloh dropped off, continuing to run after it until it was good and gone. When she came back after that ordeal, she was covered in blood, but thank God, none of it was hers. Shiloh loved to be outside. She absolutely craved it, and would stop at nothing to go out and get out whenever she could. My uncle raised pigs and chickens and had a huge garden. Shortly after moving there, he gave me a large chick enclosure made of chicken wire with a wooden frame and no bottom that protected his starter chicks until a chicken coop was finished. Since they were all grown up now, he didn't need it anymore. Because Shiloh turned out to be the Harry Houdini of cats, she eventually found the weakest part of the wire. She'd wedged herself halfway out when she saw me coming back with her food and water. I yelled, "Shiloh!" and she stopped momentarily, her huge golden orbs gleaming in the sunlight, scowling as though to say, "Catch me if you can," and tore herself the rest of the way out and down the road. During the winter, the old dirt road was a lot of fun, because we used to sled down it from my uncle's place, and it was a really long hill. But this time, it was a terror, because Shiloh was out, and I was desperately trying to get her back before she reached the woods. My uncle's property had this long dirt road that led up a hill where his house sat overlooking the acreage and our trailer below. On both sides of the road were trees that were very dense and thick. If you looked into the woods, you couldn't see beyond the first few trees. They were so close together, they had the effect of a kind of fence. You would really have to work your way to get through them. As a 15-year-old, I was unnaturally long-legged and fast on my feet. Friends at school used to call me Bambi. I could outrun nearly everyone. My teachers would later recommend that I join the track team, so when I saw her moving down the road, getting smaller and smaller, outdistancing me, my worst fear was of her suddenly diving deep into the dreaded woods, and that was exactly what she did. Meanwhile, here I am racing to catch up, thinking I don't know how I'm going to get into the woods because of the thickness of the briars and brambles, and they're really hard to get through. Nonetheless, and because I loved her so much, I was willing to go through heaven and hell to get her back. When I entered the woods, I had to blaze my way through the dense foliage with all the burrs, barbs, and stickers. Suddenly, I completely lost sight of Shiloh. As I moved in, going around and through the impossibly close trees, visibility is down to just a few feet, and because of this, there is nearly no sunlight reaching the floor of the woods. It's almost completely black underfoot, and all around. Strangely, the woods on this side of the road showed absolutely no signs of wildlife, neither scat nor spoor. Also, there were no signs of squirrels, rabbits, or bird nests. It was as though all the wildlife in the area avoided the wood on this side of the road, while favoring the wood on the other. Shiloh, with all her lion's heart, proved to be the exception. It was then that I first heard the noise. I wanted it to be Shiloh. I told myself it had to be her. When I peered around a tree from where I thought the sound was coming, I still couldn't see anything. My heart dropped. I desperately needed it to be her. Then, as I started looking for her again, peering around another tree, the sound stopped. When I still didn't see Shiloh, I called out to her. No response. Anybody that had been owned by a cat knows that cats won't listen unless they want to. She obviously didn't want to. I started looking again, straining to see through the gloom, when my heart started beating so loud, I swore whatever it was could hear it. It sounded like there was something, or someone moving, but this time really fast toward me. Instinctively, I stepped back and reached around behind me, feeling to avoid colliding with a tree. To me, it sounded like a person. From a young age, my mother taught me to be afraid of nothing. And because I've lived in and around woods all my life, the second sound wasn't particularly alarming, although it sounded like something bigger. The first seemed softer, further away, like something smaller. Like a small animal. But because I knew there were no animals on this side of the road, it had to be Shiloh. But when I realized that both sounds were coming from the same source, but now much louder, I felt it to be more menacing. The sound it made seemed like it wasn't having to avoid the trees. I imagined it was sweeping through them, not around or over them. Then it abruptly stopped again. My heart was beating out of my chest. I felt as though I was going to have a heart attack. But still thinking of Shiloh, I called one more time. Nothing. It was then that I decided to back out of the woods. Thinking that it was going to run into me, I tripped and fell flat on my ass. Half laughing, I got back on my feet and resumed backing away. Although I couldn't see it, I was not able to turn my back on it. It seemed to stay in the woods as though the road was an invisible barrier. Momentarily, I was distracted by something out of the corner of my left eye. It was Shiloh. She was only a few feet from me. She kept looking around towards the sound and back at me. Her pupils were huge, and the heart of the lion seemed to have left her. She was really scared. For the first time in my life, I was too. Before I know it, she's in my arms. I don't know how, but I got what I came for, and now I'm moving in a fast walk. As I'm moving, picking up speed, the sound is moving with us, mimicking us, but always limited by the barrier of the wood. It won't or can't enter onto the road. I stopped momentarily to see if I could see it. The sound stopped as well. It was like a dog behind a fence, keeping pace with me every step of the way. I hoped it wouldn't follow me there. I started moving at a quicker pace, the sound moving with us as though it were part of us. Though I am terrified beyond comprehension, I keep trying to see what is pursuing us. Call it morbid curiosity. I tried testing it to gauge its response. As I sped up, it sped up. As I stopped, it stopped. As I go on, it goes on. Later, I would liken it to my shadow. Not a shadow of sight, but a shadow of sound. Again, as I speed up, the sound speeds up. So I started running as fast as I could, and the sound is running right alongside me, but always in the wood and not on the road. I still can't see what's making the sound, but I'm thinking this is impossible. Nothing could move as fast as I'm moving without hitting the trees. It sounds like it's breaking twigs and bark as it goes, but the trees aren't moving. There are no leaves rustling or falling as it moves. It's as though the speed of the sound is not affected by any obstacle in its path, except for the road or when I stop or start. As I clutched Shiloh for dear life, she kept straining to look, her eyes huge with fear. When I turned off the road to cut across the clearing, away from the road, the sound stopped. Suddenly feeling watched, I ran onto the trailer. I thanked God it couldn't follow me the rest of the way home. Sometime later, I noticed claw marks and blood on my shirt and my chest, where Shiloh had been gouging me, but I felt absolutely none of it at the time when Shiloh and I were making our way out. I proved my love and devotion to her that day, and many times more through the coming years, and she proved her love and devotion for me when, though she was the cause of us entering the woods in the first place, she was also the cause that got us out. Shiloh knew that if she did not return to me when she did, I would go on searching no matter what. I would not stop until I found her. I can only imagine what might have become of us. Over the years I have thought on this incident many times, and have come to the conclusion that whatever made the sound, it wasn't actually threatening us, more like it was escorting us. It never tried to hurt me or Shiloh. Rather, the sound seemed to be telling us to get out of the woods. I think it may very well have been protecting us. From what, we never knew. Strangely, whatever the hell it was, and as long as I lived there, I never walked down that section of road again. And stranger still, Shiloh never went into the woods on that side of the road either. All we knew is that whatever it was in the woods scared the living hell out of us.